Greetings and thanks for joining me for another art wellness tutorial video. Today we're going to be making one of my favorite avenues of art making, which is Scratchboard. If you've ever seen any of these little kits before, it's basically what we're making, but it's homemade instead of store-bought. So what I have gathered here are some of my go-to materials for making Scratchboard. I have Bristol paper, Crayola crayons, oil pastels work. I've used them once, but the crayon typically works better because it's waxy, and that wax creates a nice layer between the paper and the paint. And now the paint you're going to want to use is temper paint. It's like a poster paint. Any color works. I like to use black because it contrasts the colors of the crayons the most. And then you're going to need something to move the paint around, so you can use paintbrushes. By all means, feel free to finger paint. I really find that these sponge brushes work really well, so that's typically what I use. And then once all the paint dries, you're going to need scratching tools. So I just have a variety here, things you might find at home, such as cuticle sticks, toothpicks. I even have a plastic fork that works. If you happen to have any of these little scratching kits, they do come with tools, but I've lost mine. When I was an undergrad, I'd use an X-Acto knife, but depending on who you're creating this art with, you might want to consider the safety or practicality of using that tool. Now I want to just take a little bit of time to talk about the paper I'm using, because if you're anything like I was when I was first learning how to make Scratchboard, I had no idea what Bristol was. It's very much like cardstock. It's thick and smooth paper. For Scratchboard, you don't want to use regular thin paper because that would make the corners curl up when it's wet with all the paint. Watercolor paper works because it has a nice grit on the paper. It would hold the crayon, and the waxiness of the crayon would smooth out the paper enough, and it's thick enough that the paint wouldn't make the corners curl. Another option is just to use a piece of cardboard or the cardboard piece of an old sketchbook. Poster board could also be a great choice. If you choose to use poster board, just make sure that you color on the matte side, not the glossy side. Pretty much anything that is just a little denser than regular paper. What you have on hand, just pioneer and try something new. I am going to be using the Bristol board that I have on hand. I'm going to cut it down to size because the paper dimensions that I have are rather large, and you do color the entire sheet with a very heavy pressure with the crayon, and your hand can get really tired from doing that. So I'm going to just cut the piece down a little smaller to save my hand muscles. Now that my Bristol paper is a more manageable size, I'm ready to start coloring it. Feel free to use any colors that you want. There's really no rhyme or reason to how you put the color down. The main thing you want to keep in mind is that you do want to use a heavy pressure when you're applying the crayon. This wax helps keep the paint from adhering or soaking into the paper, because if it does that, you're not going to be able to scratch away to see the color. It will dry to the paper, and then as you scratch away, it's just going to take the paper up and it'll just be white underneath, or you might even tear the paper. So it is important to apply your crayon at a really heavy pressure. I typically pick about 4 or 5 colors and just add them continuously until the paper is full. I don't like to think too much about the pattern or how I lay down the color. I use this process to kind of zone out and relax and get a little bit of energy out through the heavy markings. I think this is a great family project. Little kids can definitely do this part. Some of the more detailed parts might need to be done by an adult or an older child, but every element of this project has a piece for everybody. So this is a great way to get the entire family involved. So go ahead and grab your colors, grab the family if you want, get comfortable, and prepare to color for the next 20 to 30 minutes until you fill the entire page. Alright, so here's my page completely colored. For the same reason that we want to color with a heavy stroke, we want to also fill the entire page, because if we leave any of the paper exposed, that paint is just going to stick to it and it's going to make it harder to scratch off. One thing you'll want to do before you continue on is get rid of those little crayon shavings. You can brush them off or use a paintbrush to sweep them off. The next step is to add the paint, so I'm going to protect my space by just laying down a scrap of cardboard underneath the paper. And depending on what kind of age groups you have working with you as you start to paint this, you might want to add the paint to a paper plate or a paper bowl and just have the children dip the paint brush into that and then apply it to the page. You don't have to use any water, you don't have to wet your brush. I typically apply the paint straight to the paper. This way I know exactly how much paint I use. I'm not wasting any by putting it in a dish. When I apply it straight to the page, I know exactly how much to use or how much I need to add, and there's no waste. So you're just going to take whatever paint tool you've gathered to spread the paint across the entire page, trying to keep it as even as possible. If it's too thick in certain spots, it's just going to take longer to dry. Depending on what you use to spread the paint, you might be able to see some of the color through it. That color will go away once the paint dries. It might just show through. Depends on how you feel about that. If you don't want it to show, just add more paint. But remember, the more paint you add, the longer it will take to dry. It is very important to let the paint dry completely before you move on to the next step. So I just wanted to show you guys what this looks like in the process of drying. You'll know it's completely dry when it's all matte. That glossy part in the middle shows that it's still wet because that part was a little thicker in paint, so it's going to take longer to dry. I did take the paper to my hairdryer, but I only use the cool setting. If you use the hot setting, it's going to make the paint dry too much so that it cracks and peels off of the paper. So if you use a blow dryer, just use it on cool setting. And I just want to reiterate, you have to wait for it to dry completely before you move on to the next step. Otherwise, if you try to scratch at it while the paint is still wet, it's going to be goopy and make messy lines, and you're not going to get a pristine pattern. Even though I did try to hurry up the drying process, I am going to leave it overnight and come back to it in the morning. Alright, now that my piece is fully dried, I'm ready to move on to the next step. You can see that the corners have curled a little bit. This is kind of just the natural process of things getting wet and then drying. It'll be okay. In the end, I plan to frame it, so it's going to flatten out those corners anyway. Now I'm just going to remind you guys of the tools that we can use to scratch away. I have toothpicks, fork, cuticle stick. I also thought that I could use a mechanical pencil if I push the lead down, and it'll scratch really well with that fine point. And I also found these stencils, and I thought that I would try to incorporate those some way. So now with all our tools, we are ready to get started. It's the moment we've all been waiting for. This is seriously one of my most favorite ways to relax, calm down, and just put some pattern on a paper. I don't think too much about what I'm making, I just let the pattern come from my hand naturally. Another reason you don't want to overthink what you decide to scratch or draw is you can't erase this, so just let it flow naturally. I'd like to remind you it's process over product. So just find a repetitive mark that you're comfortable making and make it over and over again. That repetition is going to help you zone out and relax. So I hope you'll just take time to enjoy the process and enjoy the feeling of scratching away the paint to see what's underneath and see what you can make out of it. Depending on how zoned out you get, you may notice or you may not notice the black dust that accumulates from scratching away. Just be prepared and keep that in mind as you create. The mess is part of the creative process. I would also encourage you to keep in mind that the paint may continue to chip away from the areas where it's been scratched off, so you might consider spraying a clear sealant on top or framing it. This will keep everything in place and also help to straighten out those corners if they curled for you. So there you have it, the full step-by-step process of making and creating Scratchboard. I hope that you enjoyed this as much as I always do, and I hope you continue to make time for your wellness, and I hope you'll come back and make some more art with me in the future.